Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura,
And I'm Tom, or I'm sorry, I should say, what is I am Tom?
and this is episode number 13. So, as Tom gave a hint to, this week we are going to talk about game show scandals. So, this will be a two-part episode because we have a lot to talk about. Before we dive in, I wanted to talk about some of our favorite game shows. And it wasn't until I started doing my research that I realized how many game shows that I've actually watched and loved over the years. How about you, Tom?
I've spent a lot of time watching game shows.
Yeah, like it's definitely I don't know how it is in other countries, but it's certainly, a big part of the American television landscape as we'll get into. But I was thinking about some of the different ones that I've watched over the years, and of course, you have the classics like Price is Right. I mean, I think for kids of the '80s and '90s, like, that was a staple for, like, when we were homesick. I mean, I feel like everybody had The Price is Right and ginger ale when you had an upset stomach, like, that was just the cure for that back then. Although, I have to tell you, I heard recently that while ginger actually does kind of settle your stomach, ginger ale does not have enough ginger in it to be effective. So I think it's more a psychological thing, but I swear to God, it made me feel better as a kid.
Either that or I've heard like flat soda does it. Just the syrup without the carbonation will calm the stomach.
Mhm. But yeah, that was definitely my go-to. And then you also have Family Feud, Jeopardy, Wheel of Fortune. They're really big in my family.
Supermarket sweep.
I forgot about that. That show gave me anxiety.
I mean, it was very nervous when they're looking for like the last clue of like Crystal Pepsi and it's
Mhm.
right in front of them and they can't see it.
Oh, Crystal Pepsi, what a throwback, man. Wow.
'Cause remember, like, the whoever won, like, the supermarket, like, whoever won, like, the sweep through the grocery store had to go, like, with the figure out the riddles to see what product they were they had to go get at the end. I used to like that one. I used to like Shop Till You Drop, which was, like, kinda the same, but it was just in a shopping mall.
So I don't really remember watching Shop Till You Drop. I remember it being a show, but it's not one of the ones that I watched regularly.
It was kinda like Supermarket Sweep, only that whoever won at the end got to run through a mall and, like, grab, like, wrap gifts.
Mhm.
And the gifts had to, like, I think the gifts had to reach $10,000 if you to win the grand prize or something.
Yeah, that was what? That was '80s, '90s?
Oh, that would've been 90. Basically, it would've been, like, you would have seen it on, like, the Lifetime network at, like, 4 o'clock in the afternoon around Golden Girls reruns.
So you also have the pop culture hits of the early 2000s, like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, The Weakest Link, Deal or No Deal. I was certainly all into all 3 of those shows.
Deal or No Deal, I used to like because I used to like when Howie Mandel would have to talk to the banker. It
Yeah.
just always reminded me of, like, when you buy a car and they go and talk to their manager. It was like negotiating a hostage situation.
And then I know The Weakest Link was such a huge hit, like, right away, but I think that kind of flamed out faster than at least Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. But you remember, like, everybody forget the host's name, but she was a bitch. She was so mean to the contestants
Well,
and
and that was the whole point of the show.
yeah.
I forget if she was the original British host or if she was someone they hired when they adapted for American television. Like with everything, all these shows, they ended up being a syndicated version with Meredith Vieira for some reason. Meredith Vieira got all of these shows, and like it just doesn't hit the same.
She did. I remember she hosted Millionaire for a long time after Regis gave it up, but yeah.
Well, I think the one she hosted was when it went into syndication.
Mhm, yeah. But you're right, it wasn't the same show. I agree.
But Millionaire was, like, a huge deal.
It
Like,
was.
that was one of really the more indelible TV moments of, like, the 21st century was when, because I think that was 2000 when the first guy won the whole thing. He was
Mhm.
like the post office worker or something, and he even took his last lifeline to just to gloat that he knew the answer and he was gonna win.
So actually one of the scandals that we're gonna talk about today has to deal with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, but the British version, but we'll get there. So also, I don't know if you remember some of the more old school game shows that they featured on GSN, the game show network, which really kind of brought my generation back to some of these older game shows from like the 50s, 60s, 70s with like the Newlywed Game and Love Connection, Hollywood Squares, Name That Tune. And then my personal favorite was $100,000 Pyramid with Dick Clark. Like I loved when those things flipped around and then they went to like the winner's circle at the end and they had to compete and that gave me anxiety.
I was always told as a kid I loved Press Your Luck because I loved saying no whammies.
That was an amazing show and that's another one that we're going to talk about that has a scandal, but absolutely that was one of my favorites as a kid as well.
That was one of my favorites. I watched when I was in law school and I would be up late at night, I watched a lot of Game Show Network because basically it was just something to have on in the background. And so sometimes it was like the Richard Karn Family Feud. In this house, we love and respect Al Borland. Thank you very much. Or it was the John O'Hurley Family Feud.
I did not like when he hosted. He was just I don't think he was a good fit as a host for Family Feud, but that's just my opinion.
And then didn't Louis Anderson host it at one point?
He did for a couple years, yeah.
And then of course, obviously, then it went into Steve Harvey.
Mhm, which I
Some
he's been the host for years and years now.
I don't know how long Richard Dawson hosted the original Family Feud, but Steve Harvey's got to be close.
He might have surpassed him.
It feels like it's been at least close to 20 years. I used to watch Baggage. Baggage was such a dumb show.
I don't know, it was but that was another late night. I feel like it came on at, like, 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night, and it was just very it could be very, like, seedy, you know what I mean? With these some of these, like, secrets that these people revealed about themselves.
Well, I always loved because basically, if you've ever seen Baggage, it was Jerry Springer, because of course it was. One contestant, it'd be three bachelors or bachelorettes. It was supposed to be a dating show. Basically, they would have to reveal embarrassing secrets, and they would have three bags, and they'd have to reveal their baggage.
Didn't the bags get bigger and bigger the further they
They
went on? Am
did.
I okay, yeah.
So, like, the worst secret was in, like, the biggest bag. By that point, they would have reduced it to, like, 2, and then they would always ask them, they would say, "Now, what's the one thing that you cannot you wouldn't be able to accept?" And undoubtedly, like, the one who was the most attractive was the one that had that almost exact that exact secret that they wouldn't accept.
Interesting how that worked out, right?
Then, like, I think in the early seasons, like, Jerry would give his final thoughts the same way he would do on the Jerry Springer Show. "Take care of yourselves and each other." And then I used to love the Nickelodeon shows.
Yes, so that's on my list too, specifically Double Dare and then Legends of the Hidden Temple was like I was obsessed with those shows.
I used to love Legends of the Hidden Temple. My dream when I was a kid was to be on Guts.
Oh, Guts! I totally forgot about that was one of my favorites too. I always wanted to climb that mountain at the end.
The Crag.
Mhm.
Like, and then I just realized I was never gonna be coordinated enough. So I think Figure It Out, wasn't that kind of a version of like Tell Me the Truth or To Tell the Truth, where basically you'd have to figure out like what the talent was or what the skill was,
I vaguely remember that one. I don't think I watched that one as much, but I think you're right, yeah.
and then like Keaton or Danny Tamborelli would have one of the Pete's would have to like figure out what the talent was.
Do you remember on Legends of the Hidden Temple at the end when they were going through the temple? I think what it was the top two contestants that moved on to the end, and then the host was certainly like low key trolling them, like he was saying like you got to turn left, you got to figure out how to get upstairs, you got to turn left, like it was yeah, and he would get like more irritated with the kids.
Well, first of all, yeah, first he'd tell him to lower the gates, and Olmec would go, and he would always open his mouth when he would lower the gate.
Yeah.
And then, like, that was the prison the temple guards were, like, the first jump scares for us as
Mhm.
kids. So that used to scare the shit out of me. And then, like, they would always win these prizes that, like, the kids were never gonna use.
Mhm.
Like, they like, one of the prizes was, like, a keyboard. Like, they'd always have, like, a cruise. Like, what kid's gonna enjoy a gonna enjoy a cruise?
Yeah, that I don't think the prizes were that great on that show, I agree with you. And just a couple other more obscure shows that I liked that I found on the Game Show Network was, do you remember there was a show called Russian Roulette that was hosted by Mark Wahlberg?
There are 2 Mark Wahlbergs, not the famous Mark Wahlberg, the other Mark Wahlberg.
I think it was the other Mark Wahlberg. I'm
It
pretty
was
sure it
the
was.
Mark A. Wahlberg, yeah, the non-Funky Bunch one.
Yes, yes, I believe it was him that hosted it, and essentially the contestants had to answer trivia questions, and I think it got to one point that if they got questions wrong or they got so many questions wrong, the floor would open up and they would fall through and they would, like, just disappear, and I, for some reason, always thought that was hilarious, so I liked that show a lot. I don't know if you've ever watched that one.
It's one of the ones that I'm sure I've had on in the background. Like, they used to have, like, a live, like, call-in game show at, like, midnight every night where, like, they would have, like, live casino games. Like, Alfonso Ribeiro hosted a bunch of shows on the Game Show Network. None of them I can actually remember. Mark A. Wahlberg has, like, a long, long history of hosting game shows. Mark A. Wahlberg is very much like that guy that you look and go, "Oh, yeah. That's it." I think he hosted the reboot of Press Your Luck.
And I don't know, this is a newer one. It was called The Beast, where they had this really big British guy, competing against contestants to answer trivia questions, and you were essentially supposed to outsmart him. And I really enjoyed trivia games. I'm very into that. I know a lot of random shit, so I really enjoyed that one. And then another one on GSN was called Lingo. It was hosted by Chuck Woolery, I want to say, and it was essentially like a word guessing game, combined with bingo, I believe, but I don't know, I really liked that one too.
There was a sports version of Beast that ESPN had called Stump the Schwab, and it was you'd have to go up against, like, Howie Schwab, who I think was, like, the head I forget if he was, like, the head historian or the head, like, statistician for ESPN, and he was like an encycl so basically you had to best him. And that was another show that, like, I wanted to be on. It was just 20 years ahead of my time.
You would have done really well in that show, I think, yeah.
I probably would have, and I probably would have done well on Sports Jeopardy too.
All right, so let's get into some of these game show scandals. So there's something really special about ordinary people trying to win money on TV. The audience really wants to root for them and play along at home. Most contestants are decent, honest people who are really just hoping to change their lives with some prize money. A few of them are not so decent or honest, as we'll see. I just want to give a brief warning before we start. Some of these stories include mention of physical and sexual assault as well as murder, so please listen with caution. I first want to start with a brief history of game shows on television. The first ever broadcast game show premiered actually on the radio in 1938. The game was called Spelling Bee, and they only recorded 4 episodes. The show was hosted in the UK, but contestants were participating from around the world and spelling words via radio transmission. The first US radio game show was called Dr. IQ, and it aired from 1939 to 1950. Dr. IQ was essentially a trivia game show, and the show traveled around the country and recorded in different big cities. Winners got paid in silver dollars and Mars bars, as the Mars Company was the only sponsor of the show. The first game show to air on television in 1941 was called Truth or Consequences. The premise of the show was that contestants had to quickly answer ridiculous questions, and when they inevitably failed, they had to perform these really silly competitive stunts. So, one of the stunts, for example, was there was 2 contestants and they had to compete by quickly undressing, dressing in pajamas, and hopping in a bed as quickly as possible. So really, really stupid stuff. The show was largely a radio game show, and its first broadcast on NBC in 1941 was essentially an experiment by show producers to see if it would be successful on television. It was. Truth or Consequences finally came to TV regularly in 1950, and to promote the show for the 10th anniversary episode, a contest was announced in which the show would be hosted in the first town to officially rename themselves to Truth or Consequences. Hot Springs, New Mexico took them up on this offer and officially changed the town's name to Truth or Consequences, and it still remains its name today. Didn't realize that story because I've heard of the town, but I didn't know that was a thing until
Yeah,
I
I never heard of that before.
Mhm. It's actually the name of the town. It's crazy.
I've heard of the town, but I didn't think that that was where the name came from.
Mhm. As televisions became more mainstream in American households, television networks capitalized on the popularity of radio game shows. It wasn't long before television game shows became more popular than the ones on the radio. When game shows aired in prime time, the streets would go dark, restaurants lost business, and the crime rate even plunged because most people were at home watching these shows. These shows became the most popular shows to air on television in the 1950s. One documentary that I watched noted that on warmer nights, echoes of these primetime game shows could be heard from the street. Even President Eisenhower asked to not be disturbed during the game show primetime broadcasts. I didn't know Eisenhower was such a fan of game shows. Quite quickly, numerous television game shows were created and debuted, as it seemed to be a win win for mostly everyone. Contestants took home prize money, and networks and sponsors raked in cash as the shows were very cheap to produce. Soon, 30-second timers and contestant isolation booths were added for suspense and drama. It didn't really matter too much at first who won or lost on these shows, but sponsors quickly learned that the more likable contestants tended to lead to increased sales revenue for their products. And back then, these shows usually only had one sponsor, and Revlon Cosmetics sponsored the two most popular game shows at the time. Before long, the sponsors were asking producers to make sure that only the most likable contestants came on and returned to the shows. And slowly and insidiously, game show rigging became more prevalent. One Revlon executive would demand contestants that he didn't like be intentionally tanked so they wouldn't win and return for another episode. At first, few people in the production of these shows knew that the fraud was occurring, not even the host. Certain contestants were orchestrated to win without them even knowing. The more producers wanted to appease the sponsors, the more brazen they got. Shows began to be outright faked and scripted. The $64,000 question was a top rated show in 1955, even beating out I Love Lucy. It was also the first game show to cheat, though it certainly wasn't the only one. One of the first shows to completely script all of their broadcasts was a game show called 21, which aired from 1956 to 1958. 21 was essentially a trivia game show in which two contestants would compete against each other to correctly answer trivia questions for points. The first contestant to reach 21 points won the game. When the show first aired, contestants had a difficult time answering questions and got most of the questions wrong. The sponsor of the show, Geritol, don't know if you remember that throwback, had requested that changes be made to improve ratings.
Geritol comes for us all. You know, that doesn't really surprise me. You have to remember the early days of television. You know, when we talk about how corporations have weaseled into television programs now, that wasn't new. That's been an issue really since the early days of mass media.
Mhm.
You know, even going back to radio shows, you have to remember at the time, 30s and 40s in radio, and then early 50s, early 60s when television became prevalent, had essentially a single patron sponsor. You know, you had the Carnation Milk, whatever, or you had, Marlboro cigarettes sponsoring the CBS Evening News, and there was Walter Cronkite just puffing on a dart, puffing on a heater. right there on the news, right there on camera when he's talking about, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this is kind of how media and television was.
Mhm.
And so it's not surprising that they're going to have kind of their finger on the scale to make sure that their product has more placement.
Yeah, no, I agree. I thought you'd have something to say about that one, knowing how you feel about big corporations.
Oh, well, yeah. You know me, big fan of corporations.
So, contestants were given all the questions and the answers by producers. They were coached on body language, such as when to touch their face, when to appear stressed, and when to guess the wrong answer on purpose. In 1956, a college student from New York named Herb Stempel became a contestant on 21, and his life changed forever. Producers guaranteed him at least $25,000, which is a lot of money at the time, to play along with the fraud. They changed his look to make him look less well off than he was. Producers also coached him on the questions and the choreography of his movements. He went on a winning streak, becoming a person that the home audience loved to root for. Herb's ratings began to drop, though, and when approached by producers to let him know that his time was up, they also promised him a future job in television. They needed a new, likable, winning contestant, and they found that in a man named Charles Van Doren, a handsome college instructor. He had charm and looked trustworthy, and producers hoped that Van Doren could normalize intellectualism. In December of 1956, after the two had tied 5 times in the prior days, it was time for Herb to finally lose. The matchup was highly advertised that day and drew in 15 million viewers to the show that night. As instructed, Herb intentionally answered a question wrong that cost him the game. Ironically, it was a question that he knew and would have gotten right, as it was about one of his favorite movies. Herb went home with around $70,000, and Van Doren went on to be the next returning champion and an overnight celebrity. He received a ton of fan mail, and nuns would actually pray for him to win. After his run on the game show, he was on the cover of Time magazine and also secured a small anchor spot on the Today Show. Game show winners at the time, most notably Van Doren, were seen as heroes. He was living his best life, that's for sure.
Listen, when you got the nuns behind you,
I mean, what else do you need, right?
yeah.
Herb, on the other hand, never did get that job in television. He attempted to blow the whistle on the 21 operation, but nobody took him seriously at the time. It wasn't until a contestant on the show, Dotto, found a book on set with the answers to that night's trivia questions that investigations were launched into game show rigging. Another contestant on 21 also came forward and presented proof of the show's cheating. James Snodgrass had sent certified letters to himself with the questions and answers for each episode he appeared on, essentially as an insurance policy. At the time, fixing game shows was not a crime, but in 1958, a New York grand jury launched a 9-month investigation into television game show rigging anyway. They called about 150 witnesses, who were mostly game show contestants, to testify under oath. It would later be found that only about 50 of the 150 witnesses called actually told the truth about their experiences on these game shows. The investigation did not yield any indictments, and at the time, the judge sealed the grand jury report supposedly to shield the public from what they discovered. A year later, in 1959, congressional hearings began to look into game show rigging, and the truth came to light. Charles Van Duren was one of 18 contestants to be charged and convicted of lying under oath. They all received suspended sentences and never spent a day in jail. After the congressional investigation, Congress amended the Communications Act to prohibit fixing televised contests, and it was signed into law in 1960. Most game shows at the time did not survive the scandal, as the public was outraged, as you can imagine. Producers were blacklisted, and the networks proceeded to take control away from the sponsors of their shows. President Eisenhower even said at the time that the scandal was, quote, a terrible thing to do to the American people. Newer, stricter rules were put in place for these shows, including supervised isolation of the show's contestants. After the scandal, Mark Goodson Productions was one of only two game show production companies to survive. They went on to produce some of the most iconic game shows in history, like The Price is Right, Family Feud, and Match Game. It's from here we see the game show landscape evolve. Game shows with celebrity panels became a lot more popular with shows such as What's My Line, To Tell the Truth, and Match Game. I think what they were trying to do was really bring back public trust in these shows by having these like familiar, likable celebrities on them that the home audience could really, tune in for and I guess recognize and and feel more connected to. So it wasn't explicitly said in the documentary that I watched about it, but I sensed that was the reason that this became more popular and more prevalent.
Trust us, folks. We're on the up and up now. And to prove that we're on the up and up, here's Burt Lancaster.
There you go. These shows became part game show and part talk show, with more active and off the cuff involvement from the celebrity guests and the contestants. There was more humor in playing the games, and some of the subject matter actually became more risque, especially in shows such as The Dating Game, The Newlywed Game, and Hollywood Squares. Bigger cash prizes were also given out to winning contestants, along with bigger ticket items and vacations. The show Let's Make a Deal was groundbreaking for the time as producers made the decision to include more minority contestants in the audience to be chosen to participate. Producers wanted their contestants to be more representative of the American population, and honestly, good on them. Audience members also quickly learned that wearing silly costumes gave them more of a chance to be picked to participate as contestants by the show's host, and that trend quickly grew from there.
Well, and that's like the whole thing with The Price is Right. There's like a whole, essentially a formula for how to get picked on The Price is Right. Like you have to have. There's actually like there's studies about a formula basically of you have to be kind of outrageous. You kind of have to be you have to be bouncing up the walls. You have to have the homemade shirt. You always have to have the homemade shirt.
Mhm.
And I mean, the dating game, they might as well just renamed it Innuendo. They literally just spoke it into innuendo, not even double entendres, just single entendres.
It was very risque, especially for the time, absolutely. There was also a lot more focus on the importance of the game show host. They had a big job to do. They had to engage contestants, monitor the clock and the rules, keep the show moving, and constantly adjust and pivot to provide the audience with the most entertainment value. The host is essentially a part of the show itself, and comedians were often tapped to host these shows. Dick Van Dyke actually auditioned for the original host of The Price is Right, and though he didn't get it, he apparently auditioned very well. A man named Bill Cullen, who I never heard of before this research, was the first host of The Price is Right and hosted several other shows over the years. He was absolutely beloved by contestants and audiences alike and was arguably one of the most well liked game show hosts of all time. Again, I've never heard of him, so maybe he wasn't that that well liked. Have you ever heard of that man?
No, but it's at this time, 60s, 70s, there's a very specific type of game show host, right?
Mhm.
It's the Richard Dawsons, it's the Chuck Woolerys. There's a very specific type of game show host. It's the press three-button suit, it's the polished white smile, it's the coiffed hair,
It was very cookie cutter. Yeah, I agree.
white,
White,
for lack of a better
very,
term, yeah.
very white.
White and male.
Mhm.
That's where this mythology of the game show host kind of comes from is from the 60s and the 70s and shows like Pyramid and the $64,000 question and dating game and things like and match game and things like that.
It's nice to see today that there's a little bit more diversity in game show hosts. I mean, there certainly could be a lot more, but yeah.
It's still a field that's overwhelmingly white and male.
Mhm.
We're talking about when Wheel of Fortune changes host next year, it's going to go to Ryan Seacrest.
Oh god, is it?
Because well, that's the rumor, because who in America hasn't woken up and said, "You know who I don't see enough of on my television every day? Ryan Seacrest."
So, who do you think is the longest running game show host of all time?
For a specific show or just in total?
In total, but it's essentially for a specific show, if that helps you.
I'm between 3 names. It's either Barker with The Price is Right or Trebek. I wanna say it was Trebek.
Okay, well, it was actually Pat Sajak. He's in the Guinness Book of World Records for being the longest running game show host. Now, I am aware that this is not a popular opinion, but I think that Pat Sajak is a jackass, just personally. Just the way he interacts with contestants sometimes and some things that I've seen and read. Again, can't prove that's true, but I get the sense that he's a real dick behind the scenes. So
Let Vanna White host once, you cowards.
he just I don't know, I just get a weird vibe from that guy. I think he almost because he looks a little short, so I think he might have a little Napoleon complex going on there, but I always he always just I don't know. So game shows slowly started to come back and grow in popularity again in the 60s as the public moved on from the rigging scandal. It's actually been said that ABC Network's game shows in the 60s saved them from bankruptcy. So we're going to move on to the next scandal. And this one is a little bit rough. I'm going to warn you. So, again, please listen with caution. The next game show scandal we're going to talk about is the dating game serial killer. The dating game debuted in 1965 and ran until 1973 when the show went into syndication. The show was revived in the late 70s for a few years and came back a few more times in the 80s and the 90s for brief runs. The premise of the show was that a man, or usually a woman, was seeking a date and had three potential bachelors or bachelorettes to choose from. The contestant could not see their three potential dates and could only ask them certain questions. The questions, as you mentioned, were usually provocative, and by the end of the show, the contestant had to choose one of the three dates to go out with. In 1978, one of the eligible bachelors featured on the show was hiding some very dark secrets. Rodney Alcala was born on August 23rd, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas. His father moved the family to Mexico to be with his grandmother, who wanted to live out her last days there. After 3 years, Rodney's father walked out on the family, and soon after, his mother and his siblings moved to Monterey Park, California. After settling in California, Rodney had a pretty stable, affluent upbringing. He attended private school and was said to be very kind, respectful, and intelligent. After graduating high school, Rodney joined the Army following in the footsteps of his older brother. He never saw combat, but got into trouble several times for trying to go AWOL. After 3 years, he received a medical discharge for mental health reasons after he apparently had a nervous breakdown after his father died. He was diagnosed with a personality disorder and spent some time in a mental health facility before returning home to California. He moved back in with his mother and pursued a degree in photography at UCLA. Rodney was incredibly intelligent, and it's said that his IQ was somewhere between 160 and 170, one of the highest IQs of all known serial killers. In 1968, Rodney graduated UCLA at the age of 25, and it's at that time when he supposedly commits his first crime, which I don't know, I'm a very big true crime person, and kind of knowing some of the history of these criminals, if I highly doubt that 25 was the age when he committed his first crime. I'm sure he did some minor offenses prior to that and just never got caught. I find it really hard to believe that he waited until the age of 25 to commit his first crime.
And that's usually not how it starts either.
Exactly, yeah. But what is interesting, and one of the documentaries I watch mention this, is that there's usually some kind of trauma or abuse in the person's past, and it wasn't really evident in this case, although maybe we don't know the whole story. One day, he was seen trying to lure an 8-year-old girl into his car. Another motorist spotted him and thought the situation looked odd, including the fact that Rodney's car had no license plates. The motorist followed him home to his apartment and called the police. They responded to the apartment, and when Rodney refused to open the door, police broke into the apartment and found the girl in a pool of blood on the floor. The girl's name was Tally Shapiro, and she had been beaten and sexually assaulted. Rodney had also attempted to strangle her, but she was still alive. Rodney fled from police and became a wanted man. He was able to fly to New York City and lived under the assumed name of John Berger. He enrolled in NYU's arts program and graduated in 1971 at the age of 28. Rodney continued to live under his assumed name and was able to secure a job as a counselor in an arts camp for young girls in New Hampshire. He also worked as a freelance photographer in New York City and targeted young women to photograph. It's unclear what his exact movements were during this time, but it's thought that he murdered multiple women while in New York City. The crime rate in New York at the time was so high that he was able to go under the radar, essentially. The city was paralyzed by the Son of Sam serial killer, and that manhunt really dominated the headlines. Years later, police were able to confirm one murder during this time that could be attributed to Rodney. Cornelia Crilly was a 23-year-old flight attendant who was strangled in her New York apartment in 1971. A bite mark on her body later connected Rodney to the murder. Back in California, police were still looking for him to charge him with Tally's assault and attempted murder. Police also found hundreds, if not thousands, of photographs in his apartment of young women and girls, and they knew that this guy was dangerous. Local police enlisted the help of the FBI, and Rodney was put on the top 10 most wanted list, which did lead to his apprehension. Two girls from the art camp that Rodney worked at recognized his face on the FBI's most wanted poster in a post office. They alerted the camp director, who turned him into the police. He was extradited back to California. At the time of his extradition, Tally Shapiro had moved to Mexico, and her parents didn't want her to have to testify at his trial. Police said that they could not charge him for the sexual assault and attempted murder without her testimony, which why couldn't the motorist testify to what he saw? Why couldn't the police testify to what they saw in the apartment? I don't necessarily know why they needed her.
Well, he does have the right to face his accuser. I guess maybe the argument would have been those would have been circumstantial. If Tally Shapiro had told him anything, it may have been hearsay, which would have been inadmissible. But again, in all likelihood, it probably would have just been circumstantial evidence.
Mhm.
Now, granted, I'm not a criminal attorney, but there's a whole list of famous people that basically went on the dating game as a rite of passage. Everyone from Michael Jackson to Casey Kasem to Gladys Knight to Dionne Warwick to Adam West to John Ritter to Bryan Cranston and Bob Saget and Dick Clark and Steve Martin, Phil Hartman. Like, that's a lot of pretty famous people. And the guy who played Bozo, the original Bozo the Clown.
We know from our Halloween episode that you are a huge Bozo fan.
Oh yeah. But one of the names mentioned is this guy, this serial killer, which is just it doesn't fit with the rest of the dating game.
Mm-mm. He's pretty gross, and it's about to get worse. So Rodney was instead charged with child molestation and received an intermediate sentence where he was only required to serve 1 year in prison, and then it was up to the parole board to decide when to release him. Rodney charmed his way out of prison after less than 3 years. In 1974, he was back on the streets at age 31. He was able to get another job as a freelance photographer, but 2 months later, he was back in jail for kidnapping a 13-year-old girl. He was spotted with the girl by a park ranger and arrested. Upon conviction, he received another intermediate sentence and spent 2 years in prison this time. When he was paroled again, while out on parole, he asked his parole officer if he could take a trip to New York to visit family members. His request was granted, and he went back to New York in 1977. Back in New York, it is thought that his murder spree continued. One high profile case at the time was that of a woman named Ellen Jane Hover, the goddaughter of both Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. Her diary noted that she was supposed to meet a man named John Berger on the night of her disappearance. Police were able to quickly tie Rodney Alcala to the name John Berger and to Ellen, but they couldn't charge him because she was still only a missing person. 40 years later, he finally confessed to her murder. Not long after Ellen's murder, Rodney returned to California yet again and got a job with the LA Times under his real name. So, no background checks, nothing. Didn't see that he was in jail multiple times. It was the 70s.
That's really about the best way to explain it, is that's how a lot of this gets through.
He again worked as a freelance photographer and supposedly went on his worst killing spree from 1977 to 1979, killing an estimated 100 people in that time. He would lure women as a photographer and would sexually assault and strangle them. What's interesting is that his victims had a fairly significant age range for a typical serial killer. His youngest victim was 8 years old, and his oldest victim was in her late 20s. Now, anybody that has studied or watched things about serial killers to any degree, they really have a specific type and a very specific age range, so this was highly unusual. He continued to get away with his murders, and Los Angeles, like New York City's Son of Sam, also had a manhunt ongoing for the Hillside Stranglers. The 70s were the decade for serial killers. Rodney was even questioned in one of the murders that was supposedly committed by one of the Hillside Stranglers, but he was ultimately ruled out as a suspect. In 1978, in the middle of his California killing spree, Rodney appeared on the dating game as Bachelor Number One. He presented himself to be a successful photographer for Bachelorette Cheryl Bradshaw. In hindsight, watching the episode today, he came off very weird and creepy. He gave some really creepy answers, said that he preferred dates at night, and he even growled at one point. I did watch clips of his appearance, and it is very gross and weird. While Cheryl ultimately picked him to go on the date, when she met him face to face backstage, she got a really creepy vibe from him and refused to go on the date. Rodney went on to kill for about another year before he was caught when he murdered a 12-year-old girl named Robin Sanso. He approached her one day at Huntington Beach, where he proceeded to take her photograph and tell her that she was beautiful enough to be a model. Robin was at the beach with her friend Bridget, and they got creepy vibes from Rodney as well. The two left the beach and returned to Bridget's house. Robin soon left Bridget's house to go to her dance class, but unfortunately never made it there. When police were notified of Robin's disappearance, Bridget mentioned the creepy man that they encountered at the beach and gave police his description. Police broadcast the sketch of the suspect on TV, and the same motorist from years earlier who saw Rodney's kidnapping of Tally Shapiro saw the broadcast and called police. Robin was found murdered in a park about 40 miles away, and police connected the dots to Rodney Alcala and arrested him. Upon his arrest, they also found that Rodney owned a storage unit in Seattle, Washington. When they searched the storage unit, they found thousands of photographs of young girls who were his victims or his potential victims. They also found a collection of earrings that Rodney had taken from his victims. In 1980, he went on trial for the murder of Robin Sanso and was found guilty and sentenced to death. 4 years later, however, his conviction was overturned by the Supreme Court when it was found that jurors were improperly informed of his prior sexual offenses. Rodney was yet again found guilty and sentenced to death in his second trial. 15 years later, though, his conviction was overturned again as there was an apparent issue with one of the witnesses at his second trial. For his third trial in 2003, investigators decided to link him to as many murders as they could in an effort to show a pattern of behavior and to all but guarantee another conviction. DNA evidence linked him to 4 other murders, and he was charged with 5 murders in total. Rodney decided to represent himself this time, and Robin's mother was questioned by him on the stand. Like, can you imagine? Like, not only did this son of a bitch murder your 12-year-old daughter, but now he's questioning you. And from what I gather, like, he was very antagonistic towards her. And, like, I don't know how she did that.
That's awful.
Yeah. Rodney was convicted yet again in his third trial and sent to death row. Prosecutors in New York also wanted him charged with the murders of Cornelia Crilly and Ellen Jane Hover, but he was already on death row, so they didn't proceed with the charges. Police released over 100 photos of unknown women on the news that were his potential victims in an attempt to identify them and bring closure to the families if they could. 6 families came forward claiming their loved ones, and 20 women came forward to identify themselves in the photos. Many of these women still remain unidentified today. Rodney was responsible for 8 murders that could be proven, but he potentially killed as many as 130 people. This would make him the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. Rodney Alcala died in July of 2021 of natural causes. He would that This one was tough. This one was really tough for me.
It's brutal.
Yeah. The next scandal I want to discuss is not as dark and has more to do with the game show directly. Press Your Luck was a hit game show on CBS that aired from 1983 to 1986, and contestants would answer trivia questions to win spins on the big board of 18 tiles shaped in a big square. After the trivia round, each spin could result in cash prizes or winning big ticket items such as exercise equipment, jewelry, or vacations. Or it would result in a whammy, as you mentioned before, who were these like little asshole cartoon characters who would take all your money and prizes in a very antagonistic way. I mean, like you mentioned in the beginning, you loved whammies. I love whammies as a kid. I just think as a kid, it was very entertaining. And especially if you didn't like the contestant, it was like, the whammy's going to get you, you know?
They were appealing the same way the Noid was appealing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like, it was just like a little runty character.
They were little shitheads, though. I mean, yeah, from what I remember. Host Peter Tamarkin would quip with and cheer on the contestants as they made their spins on the big board. At the time, the big board was the envy of the game show world and offered advanced technology not found on any other game show. The big board would light up individual prizes on the tiles as a randomizer would rapidly choose different tiles until a contestant pressed a big red button in front of them and yelled, "Stop." The two big mantras, and you'll remember this from contestants as they watched the randomizer hop around the board, was "Come on, big bucks," and "No whammies." The odds of hitting a whammy were 1 in 6 spins. The show was a massive hit with audiences until one fateful day in 1984 when the show would go off the rails for producers and the network. Michael Larson was born in 1949 in Lebanon, Ohio, as one of 5 boys. He was often described as dramatic, strange, and had a tendency to assume that he was smarter than everyone in the room. He would also get in way over his head with things throughout his life. Unsurprisingly, his life would prove to be very tumultuous, and by 1984, he was divorced twice and was in a common law marriage with his third wife. Michael was obsessed with watching game shows and would spend hours each day in front of the television, just mesmerized by them. The prospect of winning fast cash for minimal effort very much appealed to him. One of the game shows that he always tuned in for was Press Your Luck. And during one night's broadcast, he got a bright idea of how he could win big money on the show. He was an unemployed ice cream truck driver at the time when he spent most of his savings to travel to Los Angeles to audition for the show. Press Your Luck auditions were held twice a day, with one session in the morning and one session in the evening, with about 50 people attending each session. Contestant supervisor Bobby Edwards reportedly sensed that there was something off with Michael and he just didn't trust him. But executive producer Bill Carruthers overruled him, thinking that Michael was odd but an eccentric character and approved him to be a contestant on the show.
Famous last words, odd but eccentric.
Producers let him know that he was selected to be a contestant on the show, and the night before his appearance, he went to a thrift store and spent 65 cents on a suit. Michael had a plan to win the game by earning as much money as he could. And one documentary that I watched, and of course, I have to use this analogy. They said that Press Your Luck was the Titanic and Michael Larson was the iceberg. On May 19th, 1984, Michael Larson appeared on the show alongside contestants Ed Long, a minister and returning champion, and Janie Latrace, a dental assistant. The show didn't start off well for Michael as he answered some trivia questions wrong and landed on whammies in round one and early in round two. The tide soon turned when he started to do really well and racked up some cash prizes, a vacation, and a boat. Michael was on a winning streak that had no end in sight. Spin after spin after spin on the big board landed him more and more and more money and prizes. Michael spun 40 times in a row without hitting a whammy as his winnings grew to $100,000. The record for cash prizes earned in one day on the show up until this point only got to $40,000. As Michael kept winning, spin after spin, producers backstage and in the control room grew more nervous, unsure of how he kept winning. At one point, one producer said, quote, "He's going to walk away with the network." The show typically cut to a commercial break when a contestant would hit a whammy, but because Michael never hit a whammy in those 40 spins, the show just kept going. The show actually ran over its 30-minute time slot, and the remainder of the show would be aired the next day. Now, I don't know about you, and several shows do this. I hate when they do that because it's like, I'm already invested. I want to know how this is going to end. And I know that that like is the hook to get you to watch the next day, but at least for me, and I want to hear your opinion, I'm not as invested the next day. Like sometimes like I don't care. I want to know then like what how it ends, you know?
Well, and where this gets really fucky is also when you get into like syndication. So, like when Deal or No Deal or Who Wants to Be a Millionaire or in syndication, and will oftentimes air the episodes like out of sequence. So you have no idea when it's when it's coming up. So it's like a cliffhanger that you can't find out the ending to.
That's very frustrating. I hate that that's even worse. Yeah. The host and the other contestants were in disbelief as Michael was on his winning streak. His luck was literally unbelievable. The audience grew more and more excited the more and more money that he won. I actually watched this entire episode for my research, and I can see why in real time this is really exciting for the audience. This was unprecedented. Michael eventually stopped after winning $102,000 and passed his remaining spins on to other contestants. The other contestants took their turn, but obviously didn't earn as much money as Michael did. Toward the end of the show, by the rules, he was forced to take several more spins that were passed on to him, which didn't seem to bring him much excitement at that point. He survived those spins without landing on any whammies, and his final total winnings were $110,237, which equals about $325,000 today, setting a record for the most money ever won on a daytime game show to that point. The audience gave him a standing ovation.
I'd take that. I'd be happy with that.
When the show concluded, producers were left dumbfounded and sensed that something just wasn't quite right. They withheld the prize money for a few days until they had a chance to review the tapes frame by frame, and they noticed subtle, strange behaviors from Michael. They first noticed that he used both of his hands and interlocked them as he would press on the big button to stop the randomizer. Most other contestants, including the other two contestants on the show that day, only used one hand to press the button. Producers also noticed that during the first round, Michael would say the famous mantras of big bucks and no whammies, but he stopped this when he was on his winning streak. They watched his face carefully and saw that he seemed to be concentrating very hard as his eyes darted around the board watching the randomizer. He was described as being, quote, in the zone, with his eyes fixed very closely on the board during his 40 spins. Michael would celebrate too early when he landed on a winning space, almost as if he already knew that he avoided the whammy. See, Michael knew exactly what he was doing when he walked on the set of Press Your Luck that day. He had spent months memorizing the patterns of the game board by replaying episodes that he had taped using his VCR. Throw him back to VCR, right?
That's a lot of blank tape.
He realized that there was a limited number of patterns that the randomizer would cycle through, and it would run through the same patterns over and over and over again. He also realized that tiles number 4 and number 8 were the only tiles to never show a whammy. Once Michael cracked the code of these patterns, he knew that he could win big money. When producers figured out that Michael had memorized the board's patterns and confronted him, he vehemently denied that he cheated and said that there was no clause in his contestant contract saying that he couldn't memorize the patterns. The show's producers and the network's hands were tied, and they had to pay out his winnings. At that point, producers reconfigured the board, adding 27 different patterns to the randomizer cycle. A reboot of the show years later used a computer generated board to make the pattern memorization impossible. Once Michael's episodes aired, they were banned from television broadcast for many years, though it later did play in syndication on GSN. Michael was quite proud of himself, but he didn't think that he received enough media attention for what he was able to pull off. When he returned home to Ohio, he made some bad real estate investments and had his home burglarized around Christmas time after he flaunted his money around his hometown. Once all of his money was gone, he got involved in several more scams, including one of the first internet scams in 1995, as well as a fraudulent MLM scheme. The SEC, the IRS, and the FBI went after him for his schemes, and he fled to Florida to avoid arrest. Michael spent the rest of his life hiding in Florida until he passed away at the young age of 49 in February of 1999 from throat cancer. After his death, 2 movies were made covering the scandal. The first one was released in 2003 and was called Big Bucks: The Press Your Luck Scandal. And the second one, Cover Story: The Press Your Luck Scandal, was released in 2018. So, my question for you, Tom, do you think that Michael was a clever genius or was he a con man? And now I'm just talking about his appearance on Press Your Luck. Obviously, he was a con man with all the schemes that he did after the show, but what do you think about this?
So here's my thing. How is that any different than like what James Holzhauer did on Jeopardy, the gambler? There's nothing in the rule like what he did was what a lot of the really successful gamblers do. If you don't want the pattern spotted, then you change it up. There's been so many pieces done on, like, people that won big on, like, doing, like, the daily fantasy sports and things like that. They're all, like, mathematics majors from, like, Ivy League schools, and they all did have, like, massive charts taking into account things like weather and lineups and things like that to maximize their profits. Like, that's the whole part of the scam with daily fantasy was that those people were the only people making money because they were able to devise a system to basically game it for them. I
Mhm.
don't see how that's really much different. Like he didn't it's not like he was being fed answers. It's not like he was being tipped off where the whammies were. This isn't the beginning of Space Jam. Michael Jordan's at bat there, and the catcher's going slider outside, don't swing. He was able to he memorized the board. There's nothing that says you can't do that. If there was something that said you couldn't do that, that it violated the spirit of the game, it would be in the contract.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I thought it was pretty genius of him to do this. I mean, he's not a super likable guy. It sounds like if you knew him in real life, but I thought this. I mean, yeah, he didn't do anything illegal. He didn't cheat in any way.
Again, this isn't cheating. It's he's doing the same thing you do. Like when we study for bar exams, we talk about patterns. We talk about this is something they haven't tested in however many years, or this is only usually tested in the spring. It's only done in this way. Like it's the same type of premise. Now, it is funny because there was one when I remember when I was taking the bar, when I was sitting on my review course, there was a subject, I forget what it was, and the instructor said they have never tested this ever. And sure enough, when I went to sit down for a bar exam, the first essay question was the exact thing they said they had never tested. That's a conspiracy theory of mine that the bar examiners sit in on these classes and try and game the system. That's a conspiracy theory rabbit hole of mine. I can do a whole thing about that in the bar exam. Again, the whole point I'm getting back to is how is that any different when a gambler can study patterns and to make informed, again, they're guessing. They're still guessing. You still have to be quick enough to know when to stop.
And that's exactly the point that the documentary I watched made. Like he had to choose the right time to hit that button and he did. He did successfully his 40 spins and then the couple spins that he got at the end. Like I'm sorry but he earned it. I mean, it feels
Like that's
weird giving it to him, but no, he did. He earned that money.
now obviously in the contracts afterwards, I'm sure there was a clause. I still can't wrap my head around it's not really cheating. He
Mhm.
sounds like an awful human. It sounds like the worst person you know got rich.
I think that he bested the producers and the show, and they didn't feel great about that. So, but I think that he won fair and square.
Well, and to get back to the gambling thing, because it is a lot of these game shows are a form of gambling to an extent. The house doesn't like to be made fools.
Exactly.
The house loves to always remind you that the house never loses. It was a lot of hurt feelings more than it was actual cheating.
Yeah, I mean, essentially the show had egg on its face, and like I said, they didn't like that. Okay, everyone. So we're going to leave it here for today. Next week, we will conclude with part 2 of Game Show Scandals. If you enjoy our show, please give us a 5-star review, subscribe, and find us on social media at the Tell Me About Podcast and email us comments, questions, and episode suggestions to the Tell Me About Podcast at gmail.com. See you next week, everybody.
Bye.